My pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I've been following your work for a while, and you are probably one of the most fascinating environmentalists right now, I guess, in American politics and American culture. And I really wanted you to share your story about why you're doing what you're doing, your background, and then just some of your recent advocacy. But could you kind of share your background for my listeners?
Sure. So let's see. I'm an environmental activist. I've been an activist for over 30 years. I am also a climate activist. I consider myself a climate activist for 20 years. I changed my mind about nuclear power about 10 years ago. So I'm known for being an advocate of nuclear energy. I was working on a book about nuclear energy last year when the conversation about climate change just got crazy and people saying things like billions of people will die and just ridiculous claims. And my daughter's 14, she's fine, but many of her friends are worried they're not going to live long enough to have kids. I just think that's wrong for a lot of different reasons. Young people have a lot to worry about these days. I think social media is contributing to rising anxiety and depression. I've also long been bothered by my fellow environmentalists who have been trying to basically deprive poor countries of cheap food and energy. I think that's a big motivation to write the Apocalypse Never. And then finally, I wanted to kind of, I felt people needed a new environmental textbook. And so the secret of Apocalypse Never is that it's actually an environmental studies textbook hidden inside a bunch of what I think are entertaining stories, including about some of my travels around the world, about how you save rainforests, what's really going on in the Amazon. But the book is really three parts. You know, it's a debunking of popular myths, such as that climate change is an apocalyptic threat, that the Earth's lungs are burning in the Amazon, that we're causing a sixth mass extinction, that plastic waste is a significant problem, or that plastics should be recycled. They shouldn't, for the most part. The second part of the book is how humans actually save nature in the real world by using more concentrated forms of energy, by living in cities, by concentrating agriculture. And then the last section of the book, the last three chapters, is really about why, if environmental problems are real, but not apocalyptic, did we come to see them as the end of the world? What's going on there? And I just look at the financial motivations, status and political power motivations, and then finally what I think is underlying a lot of apocalyptic environmentalism, which is this view, which is really that it's become a new religion, a new way to make meaning out of the world and to cast ourselves as the heroes in our own dramas. So that's sort of a thumbnail of the book.
How have most of your colleagues in the environmental space responded so far? Because your book has done very well on the bestsellers lists, got a lot of attention, but what has been the general response from your colleagues?
Hostility. Yeah, I mean, look, I've had a difficult relationship with environmentalists for a while. Really 15 years. I mean, my journey starts like 15 years ago. I was campaigning for renewables and was frustrated that many environmental groups were being very apocalyptic. This is way back in 2004, really the early 2000s. And I noticed that for myself, when I would read books about climate change, particularly books by Bill McKibben, I would feel depressed, like literally would feel sad or depressed, but it would linger. And by contrast, when I would read books about the civil rights movement, I would feel happy. And I was kind of like, that doesn't seem like a very good politics if you're so depressing. And why is that? So sort of the first essay that we wrote that got much attention was called The Death of Environmentalism. And in it, we sort of pointed out, you know, that Martin Luther King didn't give the I Have a Nightmare speech. And that became a widely quoted passage from that essay. So I've always been very interested in the psychological dimensions to environmentalism, but really I didn't know, honestly, anything about energy, about agriculture. And so it's over the last 15 years that I've become more of an expert in those areas.
Yeah, I've noticed in the time that I've been covering these issues and having lived in California and grown up there and seeing a lot of these policies percolate, I have noticed a lot of people are I would say, deviating from conventional environmental speak now, which I never anticipated before. More progressives like yourselves are speaking out and kind of countering this alarmism, not just conservatives, but you see people across the different political spectrum doing so. I watched Planet of the Humans, which was very interesting, but the conclusion obviously was a little contorted for me, the Malthusian population kind of control conclusion, but it was still very interesting that they just ran through renewables and actually showcased that they're more dangerous than some of the existing fuels and energy sources that people use. But do you think more people in your field are going to be perhaps speaking out on this, perhaps advocating for nuclear and against renewables? Do you think that's a debate that people are going to start to have more?
Yeah, I mean, for sure things are changing. I mean, just even in the last 5 years, I've been pro-nuclear for 10 years. I've been campaigning on nuclear for 5. You know, as recently as 2016, people would go onto Twitter and claim that nuclear was not a low carbon energy source, even though IPCC and all the major scientific bodies show that it is. I mean, how could it not be? There's no smoke, there's no combustion in nuclear. So I find that we've really beaten a lot of the misinformation out of the public sector. I also think it's become taboo to be a climate activist and anti-nuclear in public. It's been a big problem for Greta Thunberg. She was asked, and I'll take some amount of credit for it, asked repeatedly about her position on nuclear power. She finally came out early last year saying she was basically against it. And there was a lot of criticism of that. I mean, her own country is Sweden, 40% of its electricity supply is nuclear. You know, France is 75% nuclear. France produces 1/10 of the carbon emissions of Germany. Very hard to maintain your anti-nuclear position and claim to be serious about climate change and the environment. So I see it now, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, nuclear has been good for the environment since its invention in 1957. And so obviously folks have maintained their anti-nuclear position during that entire time, mostly through misinformation, mostly deliberate or unconscious. So that part I haven't seen the change on. I'll tell you, you know, personally, I mean, I've seen some things. I mean, one of the most inspiring things that happened with us is that one of the characters in Apocalypse Never is an Extinction Rebellion spokesperson named Zion Lights. She's a British woman. She's Indian British. Her parents immigrated from India. She's a character in the book. She's famous in Britain because she had this train wreck of an interview with Andrew Neil, who's a very famous BBC interviewer, known for being tough. He may have cost Corbyn the election last year. He just grilled her, and it was a train wreck of an interview. And so, of course, she's in the book because I'm writing about Extinction Rebellion. But at the end of the book, I talk about how towards the end of our interview, she told me she was pro-nuclear. Well, you know, I delivered the book to the publisher, you know, in January of this year. But you fast forward to June, 2 weeks before Apocalypse Never is about to come out, we decided that Britain was a very important country in terms of building new nuclear plants. They were actually about to make a decision on whether to build these 2 new reactors. So I just called up Zion. She's one of 2 pro-nuclear British people I know. And I was like, hey, I know you're pro-nuclear. Would you consider helping me? Anyway, long story short, she's the UK Director for Environmental Progress, and she's a force of nature. I mean, she's incredible. I consider every day that she's working with us a small miracle. So I don't know if a year from now she's still going to be working with us, but she has just, if we build those nuclear reactors in Britain, I think it will have more to do with Zion Lights than anybody else. And so for me, I kind of go, how much has it changed? Look at Zion Lights, you know, and the truth is she's had a huge impact on other Extinction Rebellion people in Britain, as well as other Green Party and Greenpeace people in Britain. So if that's any indication, then I think eventually, you know, to paraphrase Churchill, humans are going to decide to use nuclear energy after exhausting all other options.
Mm-hmm. But domestically, it seems like the country is divided on this, and that certain people running for office are wholly opposed to it, or they just kind of casually say, yeah, we'll consider it. Here in Virginia, they labeled nuclear a renewable energy source, but they didn't include it in their new Virginia Clean Economy Act. That's one instance. And I've seen Joe Biden not really tackle this. I think Trump has said I think they have been championing nuclear energy, but there's a lot of opposition to nuclear and still this constant push for renewables. What do you see in terms of that as whether it's problematic, the fact that it's not showcased more, kind of the resistance to it or opposition to it? What are your feelings on that on the domestic side?
Yeah, it's hugely problematic. I mean, look, I'll say I bet Joe Biden doesn't have any problems with nuclear power. I mean, that's just not, I know what he cares about. I actually spoke at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. I was a keynote speaker at it in 2013, and he was also a keynote speaker, and he spoke about gun control. That's what he cares about. I think Kamala doesn't really care probably either, but obviously Democrats have been anti-nuclear since the 50s, really since the 60s. And that's a very hard thing to shake. In the book, I talk about how there appears to be two separate motivations that are kind of tied up together. One is fear and hatred of the bomb, and a displacement, is a psychological concept, of those fears onto nuclear power plants. Displacement is a kind of scapegoating. Democrats couldn't get rid of the bomb, so they tried to get rid of nuclear power plants. Doesn't make any sense rationally, but we're not totally rational animals. And then the other motivation is a kind of, return to nature, small is beautiful. It's also very irrational, very inchoate. We're going to move to a light, small energy living. Those are the two underlying motivations. And you get the accidents, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, which actually turned out to have very small impacts on terms of human health, about 200 deaths total compared to 6 million deaths from air pollution. So you kind of go, it can't be that. And in fact, I see the reaction to those accidents as a manifestation of the association of nuclear power with nuclear weapons. Some people see changes in the Democratic Party. The platform says, what it really says, I think pro-nuclear people are so desperate for any signs of success, but Democratic platform now says something like, have a conversation about what the future of nuclear is and have some R&D. But nuclear is just unpopular, and it is partisan, as you mentioned. It's definitely much stronger support from Republicans than Democrats, and also much stronger support from men than women, which is a very interesting problem. And then renewables, yeah, I just think they're hugely problematic. They don't produce enough energy for the amount of land and resource that they require. We know that you could not have the Industrial Revolution with just wood, windmills, and water wheels. They required coal in England and fossil energy. And what I point out is that the land footprint, the environmental footprint of renewables is gargantuan. It's 300 to 400 times more land is required to generate the same amount of electricity from a solar or wind project as from a natural gas or nuclear plant. 17 times more materials for solar panels than nuclear. There's a big new study that came out in Nature Communications a couple of weeks ago showing that the mining impacts are just absolutely massive. They require more rare earths. I mean, the truth of the matter is nobody really knows this. It is the mainstream news media. There's a kind of romantic love of renewables. Mm-hmm. There's two cognitive errors. The first is sort of the naturalistic fallacy. That's deriving an ought from an is. That's sort of imagining. That sort of says, well, that's sort of saying, well, because there's climate change, we should go back to living like we did before there was climate change. That's a naturalistic fallacy. But the other one is the appeal to nature fallacy. That's like the person that goes into the grocery store and goes, oh, this brand of peanut butter is better because it says natural on it. The idea is that some things are natural, some things aren't, and the things that are natural are better. That's just dumb, right? Solar panels are no more natural than a nuclear power plant. And things that are natural include coronavirus. So, I mean, coronavirus is natural, so obviously we don't think coronavirus is good. So these fallacies, they operate on the unconscious. And so like just the word renewables, I mean, it just sounds right. You point out whale oil is technically a renewable resource, but do we want to kill whales for their oil anymore? No, we would rather use fossil fuels.
Yeah, and I think that's also, this is probably and we can segue into the wildfire situation out west. I have noticed this having lived in California, and I remember when I exited, this push was pretty obvious, and they were really gung-ho about this, but kind of the push to be 100% carbon free, to renewables in California, and even the Pacific Northwest at large, I think it's largely contributed to a lot of the frequency with wildfires. And you've talked about this too, about how getting rid of the nuclear plants or shutting down, let's say San Onofre nuclear plants and some others, has actually escalated a lot of the problems instead in California's, let's say, lands management or forestry practices. But can you talk about why we are seeing more wildfires, the frequency, and kind of shed light on the fact that actually fire is kind of a misconception when it comes to land management, and there's a good way to do it, and there's obviously a bad way to do it. But can you talk about the history of wildfires in California, what we're seeing, and then whether or not the push for renewables has contributed to that?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the most basic question, which is fire good or bad? I found myself being, was just to be like, it's not obvious that there's more fires now than there were in the past. Okay. Now this year we know is a historic fire year, but just even a couple of weeks ago, it wasn't obvious. But I found myself being like, well, I'm not sure I want to say, if you say it like that, it sounds like what you're saying is that fires are bad, but fires are not bad. Fires are a natural part of every forest ecosystem in California. Now there's many different forest types, but let's just split it into two simple categories. There's mountain forests, like in the Sierra Nevadas, which are high elevation, tend to be cooler temperatures. Okay, that's one kind. And then there's this shrubland, or what we call chaparral, in Southern California. That's more the shrubland with small fires. Both need fires. They both have different fire regimes. Before Europeans, fires occurred every 5 to 10 years in those mountain fires, maybe every 10 to 30 years in the chaparral forests. So we know we need fires. Now there's many problems, but the first big problem with those mountain forests is that we had, before Europeans came, regular small fires started by lightning and started by Native Americans, what we call prescribed burns. And they're small. These are really small fires. And they're really important because they burn up the woody debris on the floor of the forest. So that's why when you go to an old growth forest, you see these really big trees and they're pretty open. You can actually walk through those forests without bumping into. So the Europeans came and, particularly the Northern Europeans, by the way, the Spaniards and other Mediterranean Europeans actually did do burning in Europe. So there wasn't much of this, but they would put out these small fires because they thought that the small fires, first of all, they scared them. They thought they would burn out of control, but they also thought they were burning up valuable timber. And so I was watching these old videos from like the 19th century, these guys putting out these little fires, and I'm just going, oh God, my wife is like, what are you crying about? I'm like, you can just see what that did is it allowed for all this buildup of woody debris. So now scientists say that many of California's forests are basically saturated, 5 times more wood fuel. So it's really quite a nightmare. So we needed more fires in those mountain type forests. Now in the chaparral, the shrublands, they don't need more fires. They get plenty of fires on their own. We have too many fires now, and those fires are mostly started by people and mostly by electrical wires. Now this gets to the issue of some of the blackouts and the problems we've had. The electric utility's job is to clear the area around the wires, because if the wires are touching the vegetation, there's a risk they're going to start a fire. So that's the job of the utility. But the utilities have been obsessed with renewables because of mandates from the government. So, and I don't want to generalize, actually the Southern San Diego Gas and Electric and Southern California Edison have done a better job than Pacific Gas and Electric, but Pacific Gas and Electric, because it's in Northern California, has been under more pressure to do renewables than in Southern California, which tends to be more conservative and less and more resistant to renewables. So part of the reason we had these blackouts last year and this year is because PG&E turned off the power because they were worried about fires. That shouldn't have happened. They should have been clearing the vegetation. They didn't because they were distracted with these other things. So now you get to this year's fires, And they're very intense. And that intensity is caused by the wood fuel buildup. Okay, so what is climate change doing? And by the way, you know, I've now interviewed like basically all of the top California forest scientists. So this is not me, this is me as a journalist representing what the scientists are saying. Climate change is happening, it's real, it's something we should deal with, it's something that I think we are dealing with. But nonetheless, climate change is extending the fire season and resulting in a higher temperature. So that is contributing. However, you could have had this amount of warming and not had these fires. And the reason we know that is because the forests that were well managed, this is my article today in Forbes, have survived the megafires. In fact, you have these forests, these well-managed forests, you can see them on a map, that survived the megafires, and megafires burning all around them. And what happens is the high-intensity fires are just what they sound like. They're burning literally the crowns or the tops of the trees. And it's just terrible. They burn up the whole forest. In some cases, they destroy the forest and in fact turn it into a shrubland. These high intensity fires will go from the badly managed forests with all the wood fuel into the well-managed forest, and then the fire drops into a low intensity fire. It's a really cool process. It still tends to be a little bit hotter than a normal prescribed fire, but it burns through like a healthy fire would burn. So we know that, this is my objection to this apocalyptic climate rhetoric, we know that a well-managed forest will survive climate change. So I think that raises an interesting question about causality. You can't say, I think, you can't say climate change is causing these really high intense fires if you're avoiding high intense fires in a regime of climate change. And so I think that the way, what's happened in the discourse out here is that the smart reporters who are all progressive, right? They all want to see more action on climate change. They go, well, we're not saying climate change is the only cause of the fires. Obviously, this massive accumulation of wood fuel is a big problem, but they're saying it's a sort of an equivalent factor, but that's just not accurate. You would still very well have these, you would very much have these high intensity fires that are burning in California if there were no global warming at all. And you could not have the fires even with global warming. So I mean, that's how I'm trying to simplify it for folks. And I think that's important because I think there's a sense in which if you think the only way to stop the fires is by reducing climate change, then you are basically saying you're not going to be able to stop the fires. And that's disempowering and wrong. And we need to solve these problems. I mean, none of us there's going to have to be some amount of smoke we get used to. Okay, fine. But none of us I can't, you can't go outside. It's crazy. It's like worse than the air in Delhi. I still go outside, by the way, because I do think it's better to be outside than to stay inside all day. But nonetheless, nobody likes all the smoke, and we shouldn't have to have it. It's just because of the fundamental reason is bad forest management.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's been a history of fire suppression in California. And I remember hearing this from people when I lived back there. I've read more about the issue now as an older person and someone who covers these topics like you as well. And you see your governor, Gavin Newsom, I think he did like an influencer like video and photo shoot in front of some of the affected areas. And I think it put off a lot of people. And he has this refusal. I think he signed a plan with President Trump to coordinate something, but we don't hear much about that plan. But also, I keep hearing people say, well, because it's the federal government who oversees much of the land in California. And my understanding is the Trump administration has offered to help. I think California's government refuses. They have been refusing this for a long time. I think largely, obviously, because they're influenced by the Sierra Clubs, the NRDCs, the different organization interests that don't want anything. They have this preservationist view about forests that they have to, like you said, be naturalistic, untouched. And I also think, I don't know if you've researched much into this, but I remember my dad always tells me, like, you have to put in this issue as well, the issue of the spotted owl being labeled an endangered species, and how that labeling under Clinton's administration actually prevented a lot of private contributions to helping with timber and logging as well, in addition to the Forest Service doing this. But do you see those kind of being an issue as well? Obviously, reluctance from the state government, pulling back, let's say, private stakeholders who can assist. What's going on that they're refusing to do, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, let's just deal with the first issue, which is this completely disingenuous claim that somehow the California governor doesn't have control over forests because they're in federal hands. What other issue does California's governor suggest that we're helpless to deal with it because it's federal lands? I mean, you got to remember, California, our attitude out here, we're very arrogant. I mean, you listen to the governor, he's like, we're a nation state. We're the fifth largest economy. And we swagger like crazy. We don't agree with federal laws on fuel efficiency standard for cars. We change them. I mean, that's the whole, Gavin gets into power, the governor gets into power a couple of years ago, and he sues the federal government saying, we're going to set the law that's traditionally a federal law. So then they can't have it both ways. They can't then turn around and go, oh, our hands are tied. No, come on. It's ridiculous. That's not, I mean, if we want the federal forest lands managed differently in California, we're going to demand that they get managed differently. Now, look, like you said, after all the strum and drang, there was an agreement that Trump and Gavin signed in early August that will massively increase the amount of, I think it's 20 million acres that will increase what they call fuel treatment. That's either using the mechanical harvesting or what the president calls raking, or using prescribed burns. I don't think we need to be ideological about this. There's some forests where you want to have mechanical harvesting, and there's some where you want to have prescribed burning. There's a lot of kind of woo-woo California stuff about how the Native Americans did it. We can certainly learn from the Native Americans, but I think this idea that like it has to be the Native American way or not the whatever. It's just healthy forests are healthy forests. You've got to have healthy forests. Now it's interesting. So so you have to go back to the 90s. There was all these restrictions placed on how people could use their private forest land in terms of protecting the spotted owl. The funny thing is, I mean, here's what's going on is that the left, and I know because I was involved in forest activism in the 90s, the left's position was, of course, more preservation, more prescribed burning, and recognizing that wood fuel buildup is this huge problem in the forest. Well, now you fast forward 30 years to today, and the left is like, oh, it's climate change. And there's a fair number of forest activists and forest scientists who basically hold the same view as the activists, who are kind of like, wait a second, we spent a long time trying to establish the need for more prescribed burns in the forest, and now everyone's suggesting that it's all about climate change. So I think that's sort of what's happened here, is that you see the left has been divided between those who are like, look, we've been saying it's a wood fuel problem for decades, and now the climate activists, including Gavin, are coming along and politicizing this, insisting that this is simply about climate change. It's very cynical. Look, it's politics, right? So I'm not, whatever. But I do think it's destructive to the extent to which there is a way to unify, I think, progressives and conservatives in California and nationally around an agenda of taking care of our forests. But that's not what you get when you start to do this whole climate apocalypse stuff. It's very polarizing. I mean, it was one of my motivations to write Apocalypse Never. I wrote Apocalypse Never really more for Republicans than for Democrats. People, my friends who are mostly liberal, they don't know this, but I always point out, Apocalypse Never says climate change is real. Like, it says humans are causing climate change and we should do something about it. So it's basically saying, look, conservatives need to get over the kind of outright denial of climate change and recognize that's something we need to deal with. But we also, on the left, they got to stop with this apocalyptic rhetoric because it's incredibly destructive and alienating and obviously undermines pragmatic solutions like, clearing the wood fuel from forests.
Yeah, I think you're going to see, I think a lot of conservatives have actually inclined to your book. I hope at some point I get to read it. I'm still in the process of trying to buy it, but I'll get around to it at some point myself. But I think that, like, I've talked to a lot of people in center right politics, and there are ways to work together. I think on the forestry issue, I would have no doubt we would be able to find similar solutions to the problem. But I feel like a lot of people on the left don't want to. They say, well, because you go hunting, or you do this, or you subscribe to this, or you're for free enterprise. You're not for like this you're not for this Green New Deal type plan. They don't want to sit at the table. I think a lot of conservatives are open-minded to trying to find solutions, but you don't find willing partners sometimes on the left. Not saying everyone. I think people like you and others who are open to trying to rectify the situation are. But I also wanted to ask you, what would you say are the big pressing environmental issues of the day stemming from your book, in addition to obviously caring about climate, but also these forest issues? But what else is something that people should be concerned about? I think you've talked about plastics, trying not to deprive the developing world of certain basic energy sources. But what do you think are some of the top issues that people kind of overlook when it comes to the environment?
Yeah, I mean, so I think what I want to do in Apocalypse Never is to kind of pull back from the kind of narcissistic focus that I think a lot of environmentalists have on their own behaviors and our own consumption. There's still 2 billion people in the world that use wood and dung as their primary source of energy. It traps them in poverty. It degrades forests. It results in the consumption of wild animals. Poverty and environmental destruction go hand in hand in poor and developing countries. So we need to lift everybody out of poverty and save the natural environment. And so this focus on climate change has distracted us, I think, from dealing with many of these more pressing issues. So my view is, climate change is real. We should do something about it. It's not the most serious environmental problem. It's certainly not the most serious problem in the world. And it's certainly not the apocalypse. So yeah, I would say poverty, underdevelopment, the continued expansion of the human footprint, mostly through agriculture, the outright killing of wild animals. The number of wild animals on Earth declined by half since 1970. That's if you care about nature, that's a problem. There's a bunch of positive trends, though, that are going in the right direction. So, for example, the amount of land that we use for meat production peaked about 20 years ago and has been going down. Well, that's important because humans use a full 1/4 of the Earth's ice-free land surface for meat production. And it described in the book, when I go and see the mountain gorillas of Central Africa, or I go see the yellow-eyed penguins of New Zealand, what threatens their habitat is cattle ranching. So if you can grow more food on less land. Now, I was just in the Central Valley of California, which is our breadbasket. It's like our Midwest. And I visited a dairy farm, and it was incredible. They had hundreds of cows. They would sort of step onto this merry-go-round, this very slow merry-go-round. The machines would automatically milk them. The cows are super happy, sitting there being milked. But they must have had 1,000 cows in a building about the size of a football field. Clearly, by concentrating food production, we're going to let more land available for nature, for conservation, to return to grasslands or to be parks or whatnot. So I think that's a very inspiring story people need to know about. Now, one of the biggest threats to that is coming from renewables. Energy production right now only uses about 0.5% of the Earth's ice-free land surface. According to the best estimates, and these are not my estimates, by the way, whenever possible in the book, I rely on other people's science because I didn't want to be accused. I didn't want to have a debate about the evidence. I wanted just to have it about our interpretation of it. But the best available evidence says just if 100% renewables would require expanding the amount of energy we use from land from 0.5% to 50%. I mean, it's a shocking amount. So if you care about the natural environment, we should embrace these processes of concentrating energy and food production, but also obviously when we move to cities, we're moving ourselves. Because obviously, look, 7.5 billion people in the world, we have a big environmental impact. We should care about that. We should be trying to solve it through the same ways that we are lifting people out of poverty. If our solutions are making people poorer, I think we've got a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's also a looming debate, and I've seen this on, I think it was one of your initiatives about how environmentalism should be streamlined and kind of discussed. But I think you're going to see a lot of people debate over whether you can have, let's say, free market environmentalism versus status quo environmentalism. And with the former, obviously advocating for more public-private partnerships, incentivizing landowners. And I think people like that compared to what they have been fed, because it empowers them. It doesn't penalize them for wanting to subsist and have their livelihoods, but also to care. I've seen this in Florida. I'm going to be examining how a cattle outfitting operation does that and how they're trying to restore grasslands and do that. But you see a lot of people, even out west, when it comes to dealing with endangered species, a lot of people are wanting to be incentivized to do ranching, but also to reduce conflicts with, let's say, grizzly bears or wolves. But I think maybe I'm incorrect, but I don't know if you see it that way, that kind of different strains of environmentalism are going to come about to foster competition and inject a little bit more reality into how solutions can go about. But I hope that would be something that people can consider, because you can't just have the purse of government come in and dictate to people, this is how you solve climate change, or this is how you solve a problem, because I think that turns off people.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is that Republicans in particular, but center-right parties around the world, will embrace a new kind of environmentalism. And I think to some extent that's happening. I wrote Apocalypse Never in part for my Republican friends. I consider myself a moderate Democrat at this point, but I would love to see Republicans picking up a kind of environmentalism that I describe in the book, or what I call a kind of environmental humanism, or a pro-human environmentalism. Because I think if we're not challenging the radical left, if the right is not challenging the radical left, then those of us who favor a more humanistic environmentalism on the left are not going to be able to succeed. To some extent, I think that's happening. To some extent, I think markets are very much important to that. I have a chapter in my book called Greed Saves the Whales, Not Greenpeace. I point out that it was the creation of better substitutes, first petroleum, but then vegetable oil, that substituted for whale oil twice, first in the 19th century, then in the 20th century. Whale oil was used for lighting in the 19th century, then it was used for soap and margarine in the 20th century, mostly in Europe. And that those capitalist processes, those market processes, are really important. This is the work of Hayek. The price provides a lot of information that centralized state planning can't provide. But I don't think markets are the end of the story. I think there's something more basic, which is physics. And so I mean, everybody, I'd like the right or left, but I would like I think that the focus needs to be that there is a fundamental physical dimension to this that determines impacts. So wind and solar projects are going to use 300 to 400 times more land than a natural gas or nuclear plant in a capitalist society and in a socialist society. That's the problem with the planet of the humans. There's some idea that somehow in a socialist or Ewok society, I don't know what it is they have in mind exactly, that right, somehow solar and wind and wood are going to be better. It's just ridiculous. It's just a physical problem. Renewables rely on fuels, including sunlight, water, and wind, that are energy dilute. So you have to spread collectors of those dilute energies over a much larger area of land, or use more materials to capture those dilute energy sources. So it's a physical problem. So my view is, let's get into, this is the environmental studies textbook that I hid in this book, is that there's a physical progression. You go from wood and dung to hydroelectric dams and coal plants to oil and natural gas, and eventually to uranium. And that's not, that's not markets exactly. Markets can help, but that's basic physics. You use less natural resource to produce more energy and food. That's a physical process fundamentally. The economics, in a well-organized economy, the market economics should support that physical transition. But we have seen that the anti-nuclear movement has been so successful at over-regulating nuclear that nuclear plants are more difficult, more expensive to build than they should be if they were regulated at levels that the levels of safety that they demand. But even that is up for, in the book I described going to Korea, the Koreans have gotten so good at building nuclear plants, including under this very high regulatory standard, they're actually able to build them faster than coal plants. So, these issues, there's some complexity there, but I do think that this underlying vision of moving towards more power dense food and energy production should be the new environmentalism. It should be at the center of the new environmentalism. And we should beware of fetishizing certainly on the left, fetishizing regulation, but also on the right, I think fetishizing markets, because both regulations and markets can be manipulated.
That is very interesting that you believe that and are pushing that out there. That should be something I think we can take away from it, even if we don't agree with all the premises or conclusions. But Mike, where can people follow your musings, buy your book, connect with you, invite you to comment on things? Where can people essentially connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, this is, Twitter is wonderful right now, I think. It's an incredible platform. It's less censorious than Facebook in my experience, but certainly Shellenberger, MD. The MD are my initials, by the way. I'm not a medical doctor. People are also welcome to email me. I respond to every email I get, michaelschellenberger@gmail.com. And then my organization is Environmental Progress, environmentalprogress.org. I love hearing from folks, and it's a pleasure to be able to chat with you.
Yes, it has been a wonderful, robust kind of journey into what's trending, what people can think about, and how kind of a new environmentalism can take hold. And I really appreciate it, and you taking your time to speak with me.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Gabriella.
Yeah, of course. Okay. Wonderful. I will put the podcast out next Monday, and then I'm going to put it in my column with video format next Friday. Is that good? Sound